What happens when a calm voice meets a storm on live television? What happens when a man known for his quiet wisdom sits across from a table that isn't ready for the silence he brings? The audience didn't know it yet. The hosts didn't know it yet. But what was about to unfold would leave the entire room holding its breath. Before we go any further, make sure you subscribe to The Truth Narrator, like this video, and comment below, because stories like this don't come around often. And this one, you don't want to miss. The studio lights were bright, almost too bright, reflecting off the polished table where the hosts sat, smiling their usual television smiles, flipping through cue cards, sipping coffee, preparing for what they thought would be just another interview. The audience was cheerful, the mood was light, and the producers behind the cameras were relaxed. It was supposed to be a friendly conversation, the kind viewers watch while drinking their morning tea. But the moment he walked out, something shifted. He walked slowly, calmly, with that familiar presence that didn't need an introduction. The audience stood up, clapping loudly, but he didn't rush. He never rushed. He simply smiled, nodded, and took his seat. The applause faded, but the feeling in the room didn't. It was as if something unspoken had entered the studio with him. The hosts greeted him warmly, exchanging polite smiles and compliments. The conversation started the way these conversations always start: movies, career, life lessons, the safe topics. He answered calmly, thoughtfully, his voice steady, his words measured. The audience listened carefully, laughing softly when he made a gentle joke, nodding when he said something wise. Everything seemed normal. But then, the conversation turned. One of the hosts leaned forward slightly, her tone changing just enough for the shift to be felt, not heard. She asked a question that sounded simple on the surface, but there was something underneath it, something sharp hidden inside something polite. The kind of question that isn't really a question, but a challenge wearing a smile. He paused before answering. It wasn't a long pause. Maybe 2 seconds. Maybe 3. But on live television, a pause can feel like a lifetime. The audience stopped moving. One of the hosts adjusted her cards. Someone in the audience coughed. The cameras stayed close on his face, waiting. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but the air in the room changed. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't smile. He just answered, directly, honestly, and without trying to make the answer comfortable for anyone. The kind of answer that makes people shift in their seats. The kind of answer that makes a room go quiet without anyone saying be quiet. One of the hosts tried to laugh it off, to lighten the mood, to bring the conversation back to safer ground. But he didn't follow. He stayed right where the question had taken them. He spoke about respect, about assumptions, about the way people talk to each other on television versus how they talk to each other when the cameras are off. The audience wasn't clapping anymore. They were listening. The camera cut to the hosts' faces, and their smiles were different now. Tighter. Careful. One of them tried to jump in with another question, but he gently held up his hand. Not in a rude way, not in an aggressive way, just enough to say, "Let me finish." And he continued. He spoke about his life, about the years he had spent in the industry, about the things he had seen, and the things he had chosen to stay silent about. He said that sometimes silence is not weakness. Sometimes silence is patience. And sometimes patience runs out. You could feel the tension now. Not loud tension. Quiet tension. The kind where nobody wants to interrupt, but nobody is comfortable either. One of the hosts finally leaned forward again, this time more serious, and asked him directly if he was saying that people in the media were disrespectful. The question landed heavy on the table between them. He looked at her, not angry, not smiling, just looking. And again he paused. That pause was louder than anything anyone had said so far. When he spoke, his voice was still calm, but now every word felt heavier than before. He said he believed conversations should be honest, not performative. He said too many conversations on television were designed to create moments, not understanding. He said he wasn't interested in moments. He was interested in truth. Somewhere in the audience, someone whispered, "Wow," under their breath, and the microphone almost picked it up. The hosts were very careful now. The energy had completely changed. This was no longer a light morning interview. This was something else, something real, something unpredictable. The producers behind the cameras were now fully alert, whispering to each other, probably deciding whether to cut to commercial, but nobody moved. Because nobody wanted to miss what would happen next. One of the hosts tried to steer the conversation back again, mentioning his latest project, asking about filming, about working with younger actors, about Hollywood changing. It almost worked. For a moment, It almost felt normal again. But then he said something that brought the conversation right back to where it was. He said Hollywood had changed, yes, but not always in the ways people pretend it has. He said people talk a lot about change on camera, but real change happens when the cameras are off, when there's no audience clapping, when there's no headline waiting to be written. Now the room was completely silent. No coffee cups moving. No papers shuffling. Just silence. And in that silence, you could see it on everyone's face, the hosts, the audience, even the camera operators. This interview was no longer under anyone's control. And everyone in the room knew it. The silence didn't break all at once. It cracked slowly, like thin ice under too much weight. One of the hosts shifted in her chair and smiled, but it wasn't the same smile from earlier. It was the kind of smile people use when they're trying to regain control of a conversation that has started to slip away from them. She thanked him for his honesty, her voice careful, measured, as if she were stepping through a room filled with glass. He nodded politely, but he didn't lean back, and he didn't relax. He stayed forward, hands folded, eyes attentive, like a man who wasn't finished speaking yet. Like a man who had waited a long time to say a few things and wasn't going to waste the moment now that it had arrived. Another host jumped in quickly, asking about his early career, his struggles, the years before fame. It sounded like a safe question, but it wasn't really about his career. It was a reset button, a way to change the subject without making it obvious. The audience could feel it. Everyone could feel it. He began talking about his early days, working small jobs, driving long distances, doing roles that nobody remembers. His voice softened slightly as he talked about being unknown, about being overlooked, about being underestimated. The audience leaned in again, this time not because of tension, but because of something deeper, respect. But then he said something that slowly pulled the conversation back into dangerous territory. He said that being underestimated teaches you something very important. It teaches you to watch people closely. It teaches you who respects you when you have nothing, and who respects you when you have everything. And those two things, he said, are very different. The table went quiet again. One of the hosts asked him what he meant by that, and this time her voice didn't have the earlier sharpness. This time it sounded more careful, more curious. But he didn't answer immediately. He looked at the audience for a moment, then back at the table. He said that fame is a strange thing. He said when you're famous, people don't always talk to you. They talk to the idea of you. They talk to the character they think you are. They talk to the headlines, the awards, the public image. But very rarely, he said, do they talk to the person. The camera cut to the hosts listening very closely now. Nobody was interrupting anymore. He continued, saying that sometimes when he sits on talk shows, he can tell within the first 5 minutes whether someone wants a real conversation or whether they want a viral moment. And when someone wants a viral moment, he said, they don't listen. They wait. They wait for you to say something they can turn into a headline. One of the hosts tried to respond, slightly defensive now, saying that their show has always been about open conversation and different opinions. Her tone was polite, but there was tension under it now, tension that everyone could hear. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He just nodded slowly and said he respected open conversation. But open conversation, he said, requires something very simple that is very rare. It requires people to be willing to hear something they don't like without trying to punish the person who said it. That sentence didn't just land. It echoed. You could actually hear someone in the audience whisper, "That's true," very quietly. Another host leaned forward and asked him directly if he felt he had been treated unfairly in interviews before. The question was careful, but it was also brave, because everyone knew now that this conversation was walking a very thin line. He smiled for the first time in a while, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of someone remembering something unpleasant, but not wanting to show anger. He said he had been treated unfairly sometimes, yes, but that wasn't the real problem. The real problem, he said, was not unfair questions. It was dishonest conversations. He explained that an unfair question can still be honest. But a dishonest conversation is when someone already decided who you are before you even sat down, and now they're just trying to make you fit that picture in front of the audience. At this point, the room felt heavy. Not loud. Heavy. One of the hosts, quieter than the others until now, finally spoke. She asked him softly if he felt that was happening right now. In this interview. At this table. The question was so direct that a few people in the audience actually gasped quietly. He looked at her for a long moment. He didn't rush. He didn't look angry. He just looked tired. Tired in the eyes, like someone who had seen the same situation too many times before. When he answered, his voice was almost gentle. He said, "I think sometimes people invite you to speak, but they don't invite you to be heard." Nobody moved. One of the hosts opened her mouth like she wanted to respond, but no words came out immediately. Another host looked down at her cards, then back up again. The audience was completely silent now, the kind of silence where even the air conditioning sounded loud. He continued speaking, calmly, explaining that real conversations are uncomfortable sometimes. Real conversations don't always make everyone look good. But that's the price of honesty. And if you remove honesty, he said, then all you have left is performance. That word, performance, changed the atmosphere again. Because everyone in that studio suddenly became aware of the cameras again. The lights. The audience. The fact that millions of people were probably watching at home. One of the hosts finally responded, her voice more serious than at any point before. She said that television is, in a way, a performance, that there are time limits, producers, topics, audiences, and that it's not always possible to have a perfect, deep, honest conversation in that environment. He nodded slowly, agreeing with her. He said he understood that. He said he wasn't blaming anyone personally. But he said something else too. He said the most powerful moments on television are not the loud ones. They're the honest ones. And the moment he said that, the room went quiet again. But this time it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of people realizing they were in the middle of a moment they would remember for a very long time. And somewhere behind the cameras, a producer quietly said, "Don't cut to commercial." Somewhere behind the cameras, a producer quietly said, "Don't cut to commercial." And just like that, the entire studio understood that whatever was happening at this table was now bigger than a television schedule. The usual rhythm of the show, the timed segments, the planned questions, the light jokes before the break, all of it had quietly disappeared. What remained was something raw, something unscripted, something nobody had planned but nobody wanted to stop. He sat there calmly, hands still folded, posture relaxed, but his eyes alert, aware of every word, every reaction, every shift in the room. Across from him, the hosts were no longer trying to control the conversation the way they had at the beginning. Now they were listening carefully, choosing their words more slowly, more thoughtfully. The energy at the table had changed from confrontation to something else, something more honest, but also more dangerous, because honesty on live television can go anywhere. One of the hosts finally broke the silence by asking him if he believed people in the entertainment industry were afraid to speak honestly. It was a big question, the kind of question that could create headlines no matter how he answered it. The audience leaned forward again, sensing that the conversation was about to go even deeper. He didn't answer immediately this time either. He looked down for a moment, as if choosing not just the right words, but the right truth. Then he looked back up and said that fear is a powerful thing in any industry, not just entertainment. Fear of losing opportunities. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of being turned into a headline instead of being understood as a human being. He explained that when people are afraid, they don't lie, they perform. They say what they think they're supposed to say. They say what sounds good. They say what won't get them in trouble. And after a while, he said, you forget the difference between what you really think and what you've been trained to say. The audience was completely still now. Even the hosts didn't interrupt. He continued, saying that he had reached a point in his life where he was no longer interested in performing in conversations. Acting, he said, is his job. But honesty, he said, is his responsibility. And those two things should never be confused. One of the hosts asked him if that mindset had ever cost him roles, opportunities, or relationships in Hollywood. This time he smiled a little, and you could see a bit of warmth return to his face. He said of course it had. Honesty always costs you something. But dishonesty, he said, costs you something much bigger. It costs you yourself. That line hit the room hard. You could actually hear a few people in the audience softly reacting. The way people do when they hear something that feels true, but also a little painful. Across the table, one of the hosts, who had been quiet for most of the conversation, leaned forward and said something that changed the tone again. She said that sometimes public figures talk about honesty, but they still have teams, publicists, managers, people who help shape their image. She asked him very directly if complete honesty is even possible when you are a global celebrity. It was a sharp question, but not a disrespectful one. It was the kind of question that demanded a real answer. He nodded slowly, as if he appreciated the question. Then he said complete honesty in public may not always be possible, but complete dishonesty is always a choice. And he said every person, famous or not, decides for themselves where that line is. The camera cut to the audience, and you could see people nodding, some with serious expressions, some deep in thought. This was no longer entertainment for them. This had become something else, almost like they were watching a very private conversation happen in a very public place. Then the conversation took a turn that nobody expected. One of the hosts brought up a past interview he had done years ago, an interview where he had given a very short, very direct answer to a question about race and identity, an answer that had caused a lot of debate at the time. The moment she mentioned it, you could feel the tension come back into the room. This was clearly a sensitive topic, and everyone knew it. She asked him if he still stood by what he had said back then. The room went very, very quiet. He didn't look surprised by the question. If anything, he looked like he had been expecting it. He took a small breath, then said yes, he still stood by what he had said, but he also believed that people had misunderstood what he meant. He said sometimes people hear one sentence and think they understand your entire life. He explained what he had meant back then, speaking slowly, carefully, choosing words that could not easily be twisted into something else. He said that his point had never been that problems don't exist. His point was that constantly defining people only by their problems can become another kind of prison. One of the hosts tried to jump in, but this time it was another host who gently touched her arm and shook her head slightly, as if to say, "Let him finish." That small moment didn't go unnoticed. The audience saw it. The cameras probably caught it. Something had shifted at that table. There was now an understanding that interrupting this moment would be a mistake. He continued, saying that he believed people are more than labels, more than categories, more than headlines. And he said that when we reduce each other to simple labels, we stop seeing each other as human beings. And when that happens, real conversation becomes impossible. By now, the entire studio felt different from when the interview had started. There was no morning show energy left. No light jokes. No easy smiles. But there was something else, respect. Real respect. The kind that isn't loud, but you can feel it in the way nobody interrupts, the way nobody laughs at the wrong moment, the way everyone listens. One of the hosts finally spoke again, and this time her voice was completely different from the beginning of the interview. There was no edge, no challenge in her tone now. She asked him quietly if he ever gets tired of having to explain himself to the world. He looked at her, and for the first time he looked a little vulnerable. He said, "Yes, sometimes I do. Because sometimes I wish people would listen to understand, not listen to respond." That line didn't just land in the room. It stayed there. And nobody at the table tried to speak immediately after that, because everyone understood that whatever came next would be the final part of a conversation that none of them would ever forget. For a few seconds after he said that, nobody spoke. The silence wasn't awkward anymore. It was heavy, meaningful, like the silence after a powerful scene in a movie where nobody in the theater reaches for popcorn because they're still thinking about what they just saw. The host sat still, the audience sat still, even the cameras seemed to move more slowly, as if the entire studio understood that this moment needed space. One of the hosts finally thanked him for being honest. Not in the usual television way, not the automatic, "thank you for being here" line, but a real thank you. You could hear it in her voice. She admitted that live television doesn't always leave room for real conversations, and that sometimes the pressure of time, ratings, and public reaction makes people simplify things that shouldn't be simplified. It was a rare moment, a host not defending, not arguing, but acknowledging. He nodded, not like someone who had won an argument, but like someone who was relieved that the conversation had finally become real. Another host asked him one last question. She asked him what advice he would give to people watching at home. Not actors, not celebrities, just ordinary people trying to be heard in a world where everyone is talking at the same time. He leaned back slightly this time, and his voice softened. He said the most important thing a person can do is learn how to listen. Not to reply, not to argue, not to win, but to understand. He said most problems between people don't come from hatred. They come from people not feeling heard. And when people don't feel heard, they get louder. And when they get louder, the other side gets louder too. And very soon, nobody is listening anymore, and everyone is just shouting, trying to prove they exist. The audience was completely silent, listening to every word. He said if more people listened, really listened, most arguments would end before they even began. Not because everyone would agree, but because everyone would feel respected. And respect, he said, is more powerful than agreement. One of the hosts smiled and said that might be one of the most important things ever said at that table. And this time, the smile was real. The show was almost out of time now. You could see one of the producers off camera giving the signal that they had to wrap up. The normal show would have ended with jokes, promotion, applause, and music. But this didn't feel like a normal show anymore, and everyone knew it. The host asked him if there was anything he wanted to say before they ended the interview. One final thought. He looked at the table, then at the audience, then toward the cameras, toward the millions of people watching from their homes. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, but every word felt important. He said the world doesn't need more loud voices. The world needs more honest conversations. He said people should stop trying so hard to be right and start trying to understand. Because in the end, he said, nobody remembers who won the argument. People remember who showed them respect. And with that, the room stayed quiet for just a moment longer. And then the audience began to clap. Not the loud, excited clapping from the beginning when he first walked in. This was different. Slower. Louder in a different way. The kind of applause people give when they feel like they've witnessed something important. The host stood up and shook his hand, and this time there was no performance in it. No television smiles. Just respect. Real respect. As he walked off the stage, the camera stayed on the hosts for a moment, and you could see it on their faces. They knew this interview would be talked about. They knew clips would spread online. They knew people would pick sides, argue, debate, post quotes, and turn moments into headlines. That's how the world works now. And that's exactly what happened. Within hours, clips from the interview were everywhere. Some people called it one of the most honest interviews they had ever seen. Others argued about what he meant, what the hosts meant, who was right, who was wrong. Social media was full of short clips, but people who had watched the full conversation understood something that short clips couldn't show. This wasn't a fight. It was something rarer than that. It was a real conversation on live television. Media outlets wrote articles. Commentators debated. Some praised the hosts for not cutting to commercial and allowing the conversation to continue. Others praised him for staying calm and speaking honestly without attacking anyone. But almost everyone agreed on one thing. The room really did go quiet that day, and moments like that almost never happen on television anymore. But the most interesting reactions came from ordinary viewers. People online wrote that the conversation made them think about how they talk to their families, their coworkers, their friends. Some said it reminded them that being loud isn't the same as being right. Others said it reminded them how powerful calm words can be in a world full of noise. And maybe that was the real impact of what happened in that studio. Not the headlines, not the viral clips, but the quiet thought people had later that night, when they were sitting alone, remembering one simple sentence. Sometimes people invite you to speak, but they don't invite you to be heard. That line stayed with people. And now the question is not what happened in that studio. The question is what you think about it. Do you think conversations today are honest, or just performances? Do you think people listen to understand, or listen to respond? And if you were sitting at that table, what would you have said? Tell me your opinion in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, intense, dramatic, and thought-provoking stories from the world of celebrities and power, make sure you subscribe to The Truth Narrator, like this video, and share it with someone who loves powerful stories. Because sometimes the quietest moments are the loudest ones.